Hi, my name's Walter Carmichael. I'm responding to week 3 leadership, human leadership specifically. So, leadership by humans is a failed concept. Even the venerated Moses was unable to stand up to the demands of God. The truth is, power corrupts, and even the leaders that begin by protesting how unworthy they are to lead God's people end up serving their own self-interest by the end of their own narratives. In Deuteronomy, Moses makes a speech where he condemns the wickedness of the Israelites as the reason that he and all those who actually saw the plagues in Egypt and originally began the Exodus would not be allowed into the Promised Land. Traditionally, however, it's believed that Moses was denied entrance based on his own personal actions in Numbers 20, verse 11, where he strikes the rock for water instead of speaking to it as was God's command. For whatever reason, the end result is that human leadership is not controlled by God will come up short. In Exodus, Aaron, Moses' second in command, helped build the golden calf. If anybody other than Moses would have understood the need to communicate, remain humble, and rely on God, it should have been Aaron, and yet even he didn't meet those expectations. So once the transition of leadership is handed over to Joshua, the tone of godly interaction changes a little bit. Moses and God interacted personally and somewhat allowed the fear that the Israelites had of God to create a mindset of following. Joshua doesn't seem to have that much personal voice time with God, but he does remind the people, look, this is the covenant set out. You make your choice right now whether you're going to serve God or not. If you do choose to serve God, then these are the rules, these are the expectations. If you follow those, if you meet those, good things are going to happen, blessings are going to be bestowed upon you. But let's face it, you guys are unholy people. You're not going to be able to live up to them, and you're going to do nothing but ask for problems and punishments and things handed down by God that will not be pleasant. And even though he reminds them of this and gives them a chance to opt out, they adamantly say, as a society, as a community, we're in this together, and yes, we can, and yes, we will. We will follow this God, and we will live up to the standards, and we're doing this thing. So it feels like there's more of a communal sense of holiness. It's not that individuals are holy or unholy. It's that the Israelite people are holy, chosen people, period. Whether they choose to have holy behaviors or not is a completely different matter. But they have been selected, and therefore they are inherently holy. So shortly after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel began making poor decisions regarding their behavior. They intermarry with other cultures and begin worshiping other gods and building idols. So God decides to punish them with the invasions that were promised. The people clamor for help, and God eventually selects leaders within the community, within the people to rescue them, the judges or military leaders. These are people that came from nowhere. I mean, they weren't famous before. They had no real lineage per se. The only thing they had was God saying, you are my chosen leader to take care of my people during their rescue. I mean, often these judges weren't even the most moral of people. They just seemed to have the ability, thanks to God, to lead the people out of whatever enemy was causing their suffering. Gideon used concubines, which was a common but not approved practice. One of his sons, from a concubine, Abimelech, slaughtered 70 of his brothers to establish his own place as leader, despite a commandment against murder. Ehud murdered the enemy in cold blood by stabbing a sword straight through his gut. And it's not like it was in battle. He tricked the guy and got him in a room alone and had the door locked. Samson toyed with Delilah to the point that his own ego got him in way too much trouble over his head. And Delilah wasn't the only woman he was playing around with either, but it got him in trouble. However, because each of these people realized that they had to submit to God and they had to give God ultimate authority, they were all able to pull the people of Israel out of harm's way, at least temporarily, to give them not necessarily a chance to, not necessarily to clean the slate, but to give them a chance to be redeemed, to give them that opportunity to actually follow through on the covenant that they said they would follow through on, even though their actions didn't necessarily follow what they said they would. So the advantage of the judges was that because they didn't come from a lineage, because they didn't come from a family of privilege, they were completely dependent on God, and there was no expectation of their children, if they had any, that same status would be conferred to them. All that changed when Samuel anointed Saul. And that came from the people saying that they truly wanted a human monarch just like everybody else. The irony there is that God had called them to be different than everybody else, but they wanted to be like everybody else. And Samuel said, look, if you do this, if you have a king, this will be, he's going to behave like everybody else. He's going to take your sons. He's going to put them in his military. He's going to take the best of your food, the best of your wine, the best of your servants, the best of your things, and because you asked for it, God's not going to respond when you say, hey, this is unfair, save us from ourselves. And so there again, leadership by humans, not always the mob rule, not necessarily the best idea, but leadership by humans, at least from the setup that Samuel's giving it, not really a good idea. At the beginning of Saul's command, he was full of humility, and as such, he was chosen by God. And as long as Saul continued to ask God for what to do, things went well. However, eventually, darkness in the form of arrogance and paranoia began to creep into Saul's heart. Even as Samuel anointed David, after telling Saul that the darkness in his heart was from God rejecting him, Saul was looking for someone to play music to soothe the darkness. Ironically, he ended up selecting David without realizing David was going to be the next king. So David, and of course the paranoia came in when David began having achievements that surpassed, in legend at least, Saul. David's killing of Goliath being a prime example of that. David's faith in God. So David, once he becomes or works his way closer to adulthood anyway, begins his reign on the run from Saul, and he tried to do so from a righteous standpoint. He had opportunities to kill Saul in secret and chose not to. He tried to live by the word that he gave. And eventually Saul falls and David becomes king. And takes his rightful place. However, even David succumbs to arrogance. As a king, when you see something you want, it's really easy to take it. And that's what the most famous example of that for David would have been Bathsheba. Saw another man's wife. He became enamored with her. Took privileges that weren't his, realized he was in a bind when she showed up pregnant, and had a man who had nothing to do with this and no knowledge of it murdered in order to cover up the sin. And he was held accountable to that by a prophet, but not or by a person in his court, but not necessarily. It was not necessarily a decision made from a righteous mindset. Ironically, that pregnancy of Bathsheba gave David the son Solomon, who, along with Bathsheba, would eventually use a little bit of trickery to gain the throne for himself. But Solomon, too, started out humble and asked God for merely the wisdom to govern effectively. God was impressed with the humility and gave him other gifts, which possibly could have been what allowed him to become arrogant and start marrying lots of women and going to worship all their gods and falling away from his own God. which it talks about in 1 Kings chapter 11. So this, along with other issues, so eventually Solomon dies, and there's a question of who becomes the next leader, because at this point it's a hereditary title, and so people are being born into a sense of entitlement. They have the money, the wealth, the means, the power to take the things that they want, including the throne. And so, because of these political and, in some sense, holy arguments, the kingdom splits in two: the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Both kingdoms had kings who were evil in the sight of the Lord. That became a very constant refrain in the books. So and so became the new king, and they were evil in the sight of the Lord, and they did worse than their predecessor, and they worshiped other gods, and they built sacred shrines, and they married women outside the Israelite nation. And again, it to me, it wasn't necessarily just about the king, though. It was also about this: Israel itself was falling in a state of decline. That was what eventually brought God's wrath down, was this state of decline. And some of that was because, at the very least, if the king is doing it, then it must be okay, so everybody else sees it as permissible behavior. From the perspective of the books, it would appear that the northern kingdom was at least slightly less holy because it fell first to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom, Judah, would eventually fall to the Babylonians. And unfortunately, by the time that one of the kings near the end in this finds the book of law, and tries to fix everything, by then the corruption within Israel as a whole is so complete and so utter that God says, I appreciate it, but it's a little bit too late. No matter what you do, this is going to happen. And so both kingdoms fall. In the end, human leaders suffer from moral shortcomings such as pride, ego, lust, and a sense of entitlement. By allowing a monarchy or a hereditary lineage to be established, it meant that after David, every future monarch was born into a life of privilege, and made it easier to fall under the sway of various temptations. The author of the Deuteronomistic texts suggests that the reason the kingdom of Israel split and eventually both parts fell into the control of other empires was simply because of kingly arrogance, and a people's refusal to follow the will of God. Had the monarchs and the kingdoms allowed God to be the actual controlling force, there's a very strong suggestion that the people of Israel would have remained holy and had a much better existence as a kingdom. And that's all I've got. That was a lot of Israelite history to take in. But thanks.